y'all. He can't do no more. He rich and you poor. I'm gonna tell you what now. Yeah, you know what, children? I want you everybody to kind of think about this. Be careful how you vote. Should have known every election day. Ooh, be careful how you vote.
Welcome. My name is Keith Lewis, and I serve as the chair of the board of directors for the Hot House. The Hot House is celebrating its 36th year, presenting a wide range of arts programming that propels the forward movement of social justice activism. While we are working behind the scenes to build our new permanent home for multidisciplinary public events, we organize these free online happenings via our online streaming platform, Hot House Global, to showcase the voices of important cultural treasures. We appreciate the support of our work, and donations can be made to support this program during the show following links in the chat and comments or via our website, hothouse.net. Our program this evening is an attempt to give a long-term context to the upcoming mayoral race on April 4th. We are presenting this series of seldom seen documentaries, media clips, and films articulating the aspirational activism from people identified with what has been called the Rainbow Coalition. Looking at this long arc of history, we turn to our roundtable to add perspective from their eyewitness involvement in the movement. Following our discussion with our esteemed panelists, we will begin our marathon series of films. We are excited to hear from these veteran activists and astute observers of more than 40 years of efforts to advance a progressive agenda in the city of Chicago. So let's turn their reflections on what worked. What do we still have to do? Help me welcome Rudy, Salim, and Helen.
Thank you, Keith.
Yep, thanks. Who's on?
It's up to us now? We're on, Keith?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Well, Rainbow Coalition is as good a place as any to start. One of the films deals with one of the really initial attempts to establish an effective Rainbow Coalition, and that attempt remains a very thorny issue, because now there are attempts to inflame anti-immigrant feelings and portray those attempts to address the problems of immigration and refugees as some sort as a conflicting program in opposition to attempts to deal with the Black community. There are attempts to inflame these kinds of rivalries. Once again, I remember those attempts from back in the day, and I'm really saddened to see them repeated.
Yeah, I think that immigration has been historically a vehicle that's used by really a very white supremacist perspective in this country historically, and to be effective, it's been so over the years, starting in about 100 years ago, actually now. Wow. We started to have restrictions on immigration that were really based on race and ethnicity, and that's gotten worse because there's never really been a solution that's from the perspective of our hopes and aspirations. On the one hand, we say this is the land of opportunity. On the other hand, we say only a few people are valued enough to be able to have it. And big surprise, that's mostly European background historically. So that when it lands in our laps, so to speak, we are dealing with the same kind of demonization that we get for people of color, for people who are poorer, the same kind of division that we face that's generated of people who some would like to just continue to see invisible. And so we continue to see the same kind of attack over and over again. But we also see the resilience of people saying, no, we have a lot in common, and let's explore that, and let's make sure that we do something with that. And I think that, again, that's a kind of a circular process. And that's one of the moments that we're really in here, not just in Chicago, but in the country as a whole.
I'll chime in as well. I do want to talk about some of the erasure that has happened in our history as well. I just finished reading a pretty fascinating book called An African American and Latinx History of the United States by Paul Ortiz. And it talks about the relationship specifically between Mexico and the abolition movement, pre-Civil War, during the Civil War, and post-Civil War. And Latin America, indigenous folks, and freed slaves or enslaved people were all working together in the early 1800s up until still to this day, right, to the Rainbow Coalition and afterwards. And so there's a real intentionality on erasing our history of working together, right? One of the first things that the abolition movement did after slavery was abolished in this country was to fight for the rights of slaves in Cuba. And Frederick Douglass, Vicente Guerrero, and Harriet Tubman spoke at a conference together. And so there's a lot of history that we are not told, that is erased, obviously, from our education system. And we're thought to believe that either the African-American community is anti-immigrant or the Latinx community is anti-Black. And these narratives come up over and over and over. And as Helen and Salim mentioned, they're used to divide. They're used to divide us, right? And so this is not a new tactic. We also have to remember that we have a long history of working together. Working people, labor movement, social justice movements have a long history of working together. So we have to be reminded of that, and we have to continue to do the political education around these movements. And sort of just bringing it back to the election, I think you see a lot of that coming up in the results of the election, right? Lori Lightfoot, first African-American queer woman mayor, was attacked on many fronts. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a supporter. I wasn't a supporter, but she was attacked for her just existence. I think there was Paul Vallis didn't have to do a lot. He just consolidated the white vote and gave a very vanilla platform. Single issue platform in a mayoral election. I don't think I've ever recalled that in a very long time. And when you look at where the votes settled, even Brandon Johnson's results were not in the African-American community. They were in the north side of Chicago. So there are some shifts that occurred in this election in terms of even who's voting if we're voting along racial lines. I think that was the one shift, right, was Brandon Johnson in particular. He didn't get the largest vote from the African-American community. Lori got that vote. Chuy got the Latinx majority of the vote in the Latinx community, at least in the Southwest side. But we saw the Lakefront go for Brandon and some of the Latino wards in the Northwest side. So just wanted to share a little bit of that on top of the historical context of the erasure between how we all work together historically and where we're at today.
You know, we need, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead,
I
Colleen.
said that's one of the positive aspects and hopeful aspects of Brandon's candidacy, reigniting that kind of coalitional approach. But as you point out, Brandon attracted fewer votes in the Black community than one would have expected. Although his political lineage is very similar to that of Harold Washington in terms of his mix of progressivism and a kind of Black nationalist perspective. But Harold, what Harold did was he managed to ingratiate the Black nationalists in Chicago, ingratiate himself to the Black nationalists in Chicago so that they felt he was speaking out for their interests. In this particular case, that community is focusing on Brandon as somehow being less authentic. And that is one of the reasons why he didn't attract those voters in the Black community, because they see him as selling out perhaps to other constituencies. And that level of division is out here. And it's, I think it's essential that we address it more candidly and understand where its roots lie and try to address them. And again, I think Brandon is doing a good job of that at this point. But I think that's really, his agenda. It should be high on his agenda.
So one of the things that I think we should acknowledge, and I wanted to point out, is that Brandon did well in the 49th, 46th, 47th, 40th, and 48th wards, all on the northeast side. Of those, 3 aldermen who are incumbents either won outright or didn't have a race and are African American in very diverse communities that have changed dramatically since 40 years ago when Harold first ran, where this was really the core of the ethnic white vote from north going west. And with the exception of 46 and 48, where he did okay, but and I think won in the general, but came close. And I mean, he got the votes he needed to put him over back in 83, but he didn't get 50% of the votes in those wards initially. So here we have 3 of those with incumbents who are African American, and the other 2 where there are runoffs. And in both cases, one of the candidates is a woman and is a woman of color. And I think that so what we've seen, and some of this I see specifically in the 46th ward, where I had for years argued for attention to police misconduct, for development without displacement, for addressing the affordability needs of people in the city and the lack of affordability and how our policies were taking us there. And Forrest was constantly in a situation of huge controversy and concerned as I left the office of what would happen. And many of the things I was concerned about happened. But one of the things that didn't happen was, as gentrification was kind of let loose in the 46th ward, many of the people that have moved into those new apartments that were created are actually young and progressive. And they're showing their perspective here. And what their perspective appears to be across the board in these areas is that we need to have new solutions. We can't go with what was and constantly repeat to do the same things over and over again. We're not interested so much in a war on crime as a solution to public safety. Public safety is the key element here. That's what we want. To get to public safety, we need to address all the ways in which people's lives are destabilized and how, as a city, we can change policy, implement policy, find new policy that will correct some of those ills. We need to deal with mental health from a professional perspective, not from throwing it on the people who have guns to take advantage of it without the training to be able to address that. We need to have affordable housing that addresses the problem from the perspective of the most serious manifestation, making sure that people who are homeless are no longer continually forced into more and more destabilization, but actually, along with everyone else who's challenged in terms of their housing, can be able to find some stability and a roof over their head, and so many other things. So I think that we need to, one of the things that I struggled with in the last few months is coming up to terms with and bringing myself up to date with the changes of our situation, of the city from 30, 40 years ago till today. The dynamic and the way we live is a little different, but the problems we face are very similar. And I think that we need to be addressing that and understanding what that is in order to be able to make sure that we're going forward and not backward, like the rest of the national dynamic seems to be.
Yeah, there's a immense frustration in the African American community because black folks are last on virtually every economic indicator, and that vast wealth disparities and health disparities. There was one statistic that came out talking about life expectancy in Inglewood is 60, while a few miles north in Streeterville it's 90. Yep. That's an amazing disparity. That kind of those kinds of race-based, race-focal disparities are causing an enormous amount of dissension and frustration in the Black community. People are becoming a bit more desperate in their attempts to relieve some of those issues, and they don't think that there's been enough attention paid to these particular issues. And I think that I think that that's one of the reasons why people like Willie Wilson, who were openly using philanthropy as a way to curry political favor, that's why he did curry political favor, because there's such a sense of desperation in the Black community.
And he's an example of somebody who has the wealth and put it where people really feel it needs to be. Yes. And so they appreciated that, I think. They did. The real problem is what you say is the disparity, the wealth and the health disparity, which is bigger than our city, but doesn't mean we can't address it in our city.
That's why I'm so thankful that Brandon Johnson brought up this financial tax, the transaction tax issue. I think it's time that we begin to examine that as probably the most effective way to raise revenue. It's going to be, of course, it's going to be difficult because there's been a lot of resistance to it. But I think that is probably, one of the most lucrative sources of income that we can find, and I'm glad that Brandon is focusing on that.
I think it's really important that we take that as an example and really talk about how important it is for people to understand the importance of something like this, because in order to affect that, there has to be changes in state law. And just like what happened when it was proposed statewide, the referendum was proposed to address the income tax, the state income tax, in order to make it more fair, that was lost in a statewide referendum because the information, because people didn't understand, enough people didn't understand or were motivated or felt it was possible to make that change, and so we get discouraged because we don't affect the change that we need, and then we blame the people who aren't necessarily able to make it. So I think it's really important that we do the education necessary so that when that becomes something that's on the table and people have to weigh in on it, they understand the issue, they're motivated to do something about it, and they come out in large numbers to do so. Because it's not just whether we have a mayor or whether we have an alderman, it's that we really have a movement that gives them the sea to swim in, that allows us to make the changes. And that doesn't happen unless people are engaged, and they're not engaged unless they understand how that affects them.
I just wanted to also jump in here and point out that in Brandon's campaign, you had lots of elements of the young people who came out during the George Floyd protests and the racial reckoning. So you had the Black Lives Matter movement align with the movement of other young people fighting for the rights of undocumented. And so when you look at the young people, there are coalitions being made around the decriminalization of poor communities and working class communities, along with the fight for immigrant rights and workers who are undocumented in this country. So there are still those alliances. I just want to point that out. And they're fairly strong in the Brandon Johnson campaign. And it also leads to the treatment, not trauma, and all the things that you mentioned, Helen, as important platform issues. I also want to raise something that Salim mentioned, which is, and you mentioned as well, Helen, that the political education and consciousness of, in particular, the South Side, the Southwest Side, and the West Side are direct results of the lack of access and opportunity to education, to political education, to just basic resources. And they're not alone. Of course, the entire city is affected by that, especially Helen, in your area, especially, you know, decades ago. The point being is that the fear-mongering that is going on and the dog whistles that are coming from, in particular, the Vallis campaign and other places, right? I mean, you mentioned the statewide tax referendum. That was also a ton of dog whistles to folks to say, hey, they're lying, don't trust them. I think there's this general distrust of elected officials, unless they are, you know, promoting the most radical leftist agenda by a lot of our social movements. And this is a dynamic that's happening that we need to figure out how to work with, because we have, and I'll just be specific to the Southwest Side, we are still battling the remnants of the Chicago machine that existed, the Burkes, the Dailies, the Madigans. You know, Burke is just on his way out after 50 years of being in the Southwest Side and really holding strong that community and that region. Madigan is still not gone. He is still present and operating in the Southwest Side. And so there's a dynamic where this fear of if people of color, Latinx, African Americans are now elected, are they going to do what's necessary to support community? And that's the fear, right? And that's where you hear the dog whistles also on Brandon, that he's a socialist. He's gonna let, you know, he's gonna disarm cops. He's gonna defund police. All of these sort of things that are gonna scare folks. And it takes hold in our communities because they don't necessarily understand, and they haven't been afforded the access or the privileges to really understand why treatment, not trauma, is so important. Why we need to fight for more equity and racial justice across our communities. And that's some work that we have to do, right? We're also doing it at the same time we're trying to govern. And it's a challenge. It's a real challenge to figure out, how do we do both things, right? How do we govern with progressive elected officials? How do we educate politically and raise consciousness within an area that has been disinvested for decades, if not centuries, right? And at the same time, still push the most progressive agenda we can achieve for working people and convince folks to join that coalition. It is a real challenge, and it's easier in some places than the other. And I think within our movement, we don't have the level of grace and understanding yet to understand that some folks may take a little longer to get there, and that we still have to give folks some time between an actual Chicago machine and, you know, a progressive agenda with progressive elected officials. And I feel like some folks in some elements in our movement are not understanding that, and they are not deciphering between who is an ally and who is actually opposition to the working class. And that warrior sort of mentality of being in the movement for so long is coming back and is sort of cannibalizing ourselves in a little bit. And it's something that we have to be aware of. I'm not trying to highlight that as like our main problem. We still obviously have a very strong right-wing presence in this city, and we have big business and corporations and folks that are really out to destroy any growth and any kind of progress that our communities are making. We also have to recognize our internal challenges and what we're doing to ourselves. So just wanted to put all that in context. I know that was a lot.
Thank you for that. I just want to actually inject a question, if I may. Salim, you had mentioned, again, noting the fact that with Brandon, he did not win any of the black communities. And so I'm just wondering, what ideas do you have? What are some strategies and ways that you think that he can be attract or bring more of the black vote, not only in support of him, but also out? because we just also look at the numbers, just
Yes.
and the lack of voter turnout.
Yes.
You can speak to that.
Well, it's discouraging that red baiting is still effective. It's discouraging to find that when you red bait, even in the Black community, which is extremely baffling, being that most of the outstanding Black leadership have professed socialism openly, most of the significant Black leaders, but nonetheless, socialism is seen as something that is not entirely wholesome for a lot of folks, and I think that it benefits it benefits people who want to keep us divided, to keep that kind of division in the atmosphere. I think that Brandon's adoption and his willingness to embrace various communities simultaneously makes him suspicious to many in the Black community, who think that we need to be much more focused on a Black only, a Black only, or primarily a racially focused perspective. And I think that's why. But then the other thing is that there were other Black candidates in the race who were more attractive. Yeah, Willie Wilson attracted that clergy-based constituency that's still very strong in the Black community, especially among seniors. And there were, other candidates had other constituencies that they attracted. So all of that, I think, distracted from Brandon, who a lot of people in the Black community they weren't really familiar with him. But now that he's become the candidate, I think he's attracting a lot more Black support than he had in the past. It reminds me a lot, again, of Harold Washington's campaign. Harold wasn't considered that much of a force until he became more widely known, until the spotlight hit him and people understood his unique qualities. And I see similar things here.
And consequently, people saw that it was possible he could win.
Yes,
and
there you go.
And that led to a very openness of people who really wanted him to win, to his ability to have a large umbrella. And because that's what you need to win in the city of Chicago.
Absolutely.
And so I think that dynamic is very important when we're looking at really somebody with a changed perspective. Because remember, Harold was not only the first Black mayor, but he was determined to turn around the negative impacts and historic impacts of the machine, really starting where it was most seriously impacted in the Black community. But he understood that across the board in poor and working communities in the city, that it was equally harmful. And he led with that. He led with, we're going to open up the city. We're going to put fairness on everybody, whether they want it or not. We're going to make this to be a real city that works for everyone, et cetera, et cetera. And he did it. And he did it largely because when he got elected, he relied on all of us throughout the city to participate in creating models for what he can go forward on. He had that perspective and he had that history. We now are faced with an election where we have one candidate who says, I want to go back to the way it was. We're going to deal with the police as they are. We're not going to make these changes. We're going to deal with the budgets as we've always dealt with them. We're just going to do it better, and we're going to be ferocious or something like that. And then you have another candidate who says, these things haven't worked. We need to focus on what works in terms of educating our youth. We need to focus on what works in terms of identifying which professionals should do what work to deal with the trauma that our communities are facing. And those are two very, very different visions. And the second version also is we need to find a way to create resources that actually respond to the basic needs people have, and to take the money from those who have it to give it to those who need it in the sense of the policies that we develop. Those are two extraordinarily diverse visions. And whatever you think of either of the candidates, it's not a personality contest. It is all of these things we've talked about, but it is primarily two very different visions that allow us to be able to do one thing or the other over the next 4 years. Do we want to go forward and create a different kind of path that may or may not work, but is much more likely to work than something we've done over and over again that hasn't worked? Or do we want to just try the same old, and see if we can't eke out a few benefits for a few people that have been left out? I think the vision is really, the two visions are really clear, really diverse. People have to make that decision, but to make it, they have to vote, and hopefully people get out. So I want to just say one more thing, if I can. The young people, according to all the newspaper articles, people under 40 voted in much smaller numbers than people over 40, and especially people over 65 or 70. And I think that that is very concerning, but it is something that means that they don't see that it really makes a difference. I had a question asked to me at a book event I had the other day from some 20-something, I'm pretty sure, who was an activist who said, you were inside and outside of government, you did both things, why should we do that? And what I realized, and I answered to him, is we don't talk about power. You can't make a change unless you engage in the power, and the power that people have, who has the power now to do the things that we don't agree with. So we need to engage in power. We need to be able to get people in positions where they can be part of the discussion, representing our interests as part of those discussions. And if we don't do that, we're not serious. We're just playing a game. We think we are, and I understand why we do, but we're not, because you have to not only speak power to power, you need to be able to be in a position to impact power and to have a piece of it. So I think that that's a conversation that we really need to have with all the people, Rudy, you were talking about, because if that is key, then we don't get caught up in the petty squabbles.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
much,
And,
so much.
yeah, I mean, I think the petty squabbles are natural tensions that exist in our movement, and they're going to be there. It's how we handle them.
Yeah.
That's right. It's how we handle them is going to be important. And I think, speaking to the coalition that Brandon has built, multiracial, multi-generational, labor is at the center of this coalition. There are social movement activists at the center of this coalition. To both your points, Salim and Helen, it's now time to organize everyday people, right? It's time to activate everyday people. And how do we do that, right? And how do we do that effectively? I think the platform is right. You know, the policy agenda is spot on. It's getting Brandon out in front of people and motivating people to come out and vote. To your point, the turnout was dismal, especially in Black and Latinx communities. It was dismal. And not only that, we are dealing with the internalized racism that a lot of our communities, I mean, Vallis was either in second and third place in a lot of our communities in the South and West Side. And that is problematic. That tells us we have a lot more work to do. And it also begs the question of, how do we turn out the vote? How do we register people to vote? When Harold was elected, it was a huge, massive registration drive prior to, right? And then the turnout, once, to your point, Helen, once people realized, hey, he has a chance of winning, the Latino community went from, I don't know, less than 30% to 80% turnout voting for Harold across the city. So I think there are some swing votes that we need to mobilize specifically. There was a Brandon rally here in Little Village this past weekend. There was probably 400, 500 people in this space, and they were going to go and knock doors right afterwards. And so I think this approach of building the energy, motivating folks, having the right coalition of folks working together, whether we are able to take this election or not, that is the right strategy. And those are the right coalition members to have at the table to keep building. And I'll just say one last thing. Even if we don't take the fifth floor, we're going to have a stronger city council than we've ever had in the election of, you know, we have Julia Ramirez in the 12th ward. We're fighting for Ana Guajardo on the 10th ward. The Southwest Side and the new city council in general is going to be very powerful if they actually take that power, which we know this is a strong city council system, if we would just act on it, right? And so hopefully that is also going to be a silver lining at the end of this election, regardless of who the mayor is, because even if it is Brandon, we're still going to have to organize and move him just like that was done for Harold, right? So some of this work still needs to happen.
Rudy, I just want to add one more thing in terms of the motivation and what motivates people to vote. And so one thing we think about, one with Mayor Lightfoot in the best Southwest. So, and again, but we still, it's this narrative. I think one of the reasons why we probably see particularly less of Black vote is that there's still like that my community is not changing. That is one effort that's been underway. I know that both Vallis as well as Brandon have professed that they will sustain that. But I just want to put out this question of what else do you, from each one of you, your perspective of what else could the next mayor do to again spark more economic investment and development specifically on the South and West sides.
Can I just say one thing before we get to that, because I think it's related, but it's specifically to what Rudy was saying earlier, is that I don't think that this is a one-off, and but I think that obviously it's an ongoing process regardless of who the mayor is, or even regardless of what the city council looks like. That in order to grow and develop, we need to be working every single day in whatever way any of us can. That change comes from one shovelful. I mean, mountain is moved one shovelful at a time. Hopefully more and more shovels are being used. But we're able to hold in a mass way, in a collective way, able to hold our elected officials accountable, able to give them encouragement and support them when they're making changes and under attack. If we build a sea for them to swim in, and that's an action that occurs every single day, it's cumulative. Quantitative change really does lead to qualitative change and create those moments. So whatever people are doing, whatever they're doing in their communities that engages people and allows them to be able to learn more about what's going on, explore the options, change their minds and other people's minds is what we need to do in order to be able to do any of these things. And also to be able to then impact whatever policies the mayor does come up with, get support from the other aldermen in order to be able to affect and deal with the questions that you're asking, Keith. I think that whatever happens in that arena, we need to be able to make sure that everyone understands the value and the worth of what they do every single day to address these questions. I'm off the soapbox.
Yeah, I think the outline, the way that Helen described this contest between the same old and the effort to try new things and to inspire people with a new spurt of energy is the way to cast this, because one of the things that is really a very powerful, and we saw it in the campaign. Every candidate focused on crime, and the reason they did is because every poll said that crime was the overwhelming concern of the constituents of the voters in Chicago. And so crime is such a contentious issue, and it is disrupting a lot of the logical conclusions. You know, it's coming into it's diverting attention from issues that should be really focused on, like, for example, lead. The problem of lead in our water. I mean, in the Black community, lead is poisoning, really still at this particular time, it's poisoning children and limiting their IQ capacities, even as we speak.
Affecting their behavior, which puts them right in touch with the criminal justice system.
Exactly right, exactly. And no one's speaking about this issue because it's too exhausting. You know, we don't have the luxury of even thinking about it because we don't have the resources.
But Salim, that's part of public safety. That's my point. It should stop talking about crime and start talking about public safety.
Precisely right. And that's why I think that an issue like this financial, and I keep coming back to it because I think it is essential that we find ways to raise revenue. And I don't think there's I don't think there's a more potent direction to look. I don't think there's a reservoir that is equal to what we could find if we were to go to the financial transaction tax.
Good idea.
I want to answer your question too, Keith, around what can be done. I think investment, right? Investment. I think that's where folks missed the boat on Lori's support, right? The Invest Southwest, in my opinion, and what I've heard, is the reason why the Black community voted for Lori. She invested in that. She put some dollars in those communities and folks returned with votes, right? And so I think we need to do that. We need to invest in our communities. We need to invest in our schools and our healthcare, all the issues, housing, et cetera. And I think we need to continue to do, I think, what Helen was talking about, which is how do we continue to build unity and opportunities for everyday people to get engaged, right? And to me, the question of unity is really critical. This is the 40th year anniversary of Harold's election. This is also the 40th year anniversary of a lot of the independent political organizations. For the 22nd Ward, we claim the longest standing IPO, right? And we're going to celebrate 40 years this year. And we have a lot to celebrate. From 40 years ago when we had 0 elected officials in office to now we're at every level of government. And we still have a lot of work to do, right? We still have a ton of work to do. And fighting for unity is our legacy as an organization, as a city. Anyone who was in the Harold Washington movement, Helen, you were very much a symbol of that for a very long time during some rough times. When it's just you were alone in the city council. And so we need to continue to fight, even if we're alone sometimes, which we've felt that way for quite some time. I think the last 10 years have been an amazing shift in not only the politic in the city, but just social movements, young people. Technology has taken hold in our organizing efforts. And I think one of the last things I'll just mention is we also need to get back to how do we heal our communities? Because we are dealing with a lot of trauma. And it, once again, sometimes we take it out on each other. We may want to call it squabbles, but no, this is trauma, right? And we need real attention on how we do that. And what I'm coining as healing-centered leadership and healing-centered organizing through a popular education approach needs to happen in the city. And we need to embrace that and sort of be able to switch that warrior mentality from that's a real opponent, that's a real force that we have to deal with, and recognize who our allies are. And I think that's a real critical moment as well within our movement. And we need to hold this unity if we're going to continue to make progress in this city.
Helen Schiller was like an Angela Davis figure in the city council. She was beautiful and ideologically astute. She was an amazing combination.
And pragmatic. Dealing with everything. You are still here. You are still here. We're just we're just.
But, I think we need to be more intentional also in trying to focus more on alliances in the Latinx and African American community. We need to bring us all of us up to speed on new ideological iterations on how we can sharpen our alliances, how we can strengthen them, because I see frays and we need to be attentive to those frays and try to heal them.
So I want to thank all of you. I hate to be the one that has to end this stimulating dialogue, but we're at time. But I again want to thank our esteemed panelists, Helen Schiller, SALIM MUWAKKIL, and RUDY LOZANO Jr. for your perspective on this upcoming mayoral election. This is what we do here at the Hot House, is through this platform of Hot House Global, we bring popular education through culture. So I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. At the end, please stay tuned for NATIONTIME, which is a documentary about the Black national movement for political empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vote, y'all. Well, on every election day, woo. Be careful how you vote on every election day. The one that you vote for